It was 11 o'clock at night when Jake Mitchell heard the pounding on his farmhouse door in rural Montana. Outside, rain hammered the earth, and wind howled through the pines. Jake, 45 years old, had lived alone since his wife Sarah died of cancer 3 years earlier. He never had visitors, especially not at that hour. When he opened the door, he froze. Standing there was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, soaking wet, her dress torn, face streaked with tears and blood. Before Jake could speak, the child burst into desperate sobs and screamed words that turned his blood to ice. "Please help my mom. He beat her. She's dying. There's blood everywhere." What Jake did in the next minutes didn't just save 2 lives. It shook their entire Montana community and exposed a truth so dark that nobody could have imagined it. Because this little girl wasn't running from a simple domestic accident. She was running from a monster that everyone in town believed was a respectable man. Jake Mitchell sat in front of the fireplace in his farmhouse, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching flames dance in the darkness. It was another lonely evening in the 3 years since Sarah had passed. The farm, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, now echoed only with his footsteps. The storm had rolled in that afternoon, one of those Montana autumn storms that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. Jake had spent the day fixing the barn roof and moving the cattle to shelter. Now, at 11 p.m., he was exhausted and about to head to bed when he heard it, pounding. Loud, insistent, desperate. Jake stood up fast, his heart starting to race. Who could it be at this hour, in this weather? The farm was isolated 5 miles from the nearest town, Timber Creek, a small community of 2,000 people nestled in the valley. The road to his property was unpaved and nearly impassable in heavy rain. When he opened the door, the scene left him breathless. A small girl, perhaps 7, stood shivering in the pouring rain. Her red dress was torn in several places, blonde hair plastered to her face, blue eyes huge and terrified. She had scratches on her arms and blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Jake immediately knelt to her level, his voice trying to stay calm despite the shock. The girl erupted into hysterical crying, words tumbling out between sobs. She said her name was Emma, that her mom was in danger, that a man had beaten her, that there was blood everywhere, that she'd run through the fields in the dark looking for help, that this was the first house she'd seen. Jake didn't waste time. He lifted the child inside, wrapped her in a warm blanket, and immediately called 911 and the sheriff. Then, with a gentle but firm voice, he tried to get her to say where she lived, where her mother was. Emma pointed vaguely south, toward an area Jake knew well. There were only 3 houses in that direction. One had been abandoned for years. One belonged to David Harrison, a respected lawyer in town. And one was owned by Tom Anderson, a farmer in his 60s that Jake knew by sight. Trying to stay calm, Jake asked Emma what her mother's name was. The child, trembling under the blanket, whispered a name that made Jake's heart stop. Rachel Harrison. Jake's blood ran cold. Rachel Harrison was David Harrison's wife. Jake knew him, like everyone in town. David was considered a pillar of the community, always well-dressed, always polite, member of the town council, benefactor of the local church. Nobody would ever think, but there was no time for doubt. Jake told Emma to stay there, safe, that he'd return with her mother. Then he ran out into the rain, jumped in his pickup, and headed toward the Harrison property. The road was a disaster, deep puddles and mud everywhere. Jake drove as fast as he could, his heart hammering. He kept seeing that little girl's terrified face, the blood, the tears. If what she'd said was true, every second counted. The Harrison house appeared after 10 minutes of wild driving. It was a beautiful, renovated country home with a manicured yard and wrought iron gate. Usually there were lights on, but that night it was completely dark, like abandoned. Jake stopped the truck at the gate and got out. The gate was open, which was strange. He ran through the yard, rain blinding him. The front door was ajar. A chill ran down his spine. Something terrible had happened inside. He entered calling out, his voice echoing through the dark, silent house. Then he saw faint light coming from the living room, and what he saw nearly made him sick. Rachel Harrison was collapsed on the living room floor in a pool of blood. Her face was swollen, bruises everywhere, her dress torn. She was barely breathing, weak rattles coming from her split lips. Jake rushed to her, checking her pulse. It was weak, but there. He called 911 again, shouting the address, saying there was a woman critically injured, that they needed an ambulance immediately. Then, with trembling hands, he tried to stabilize Rachel as he'd learned in a first aid course years ago. He talked to her, saying she was safe, that Emma was okay, that help was coming. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he kept talking because he didn't know what else to do. It was only after several minutes that he realized something chilling. David Harrison wasn't there. The house was empty, except for Rachel, dying on the floor. Where had he gone? Had he done this to her? And then run? Sirens sounded in the distance, slowly approaching on the muddy road. Jake stayed beside Rachel, holding her hand, praying she'd hold on. That quiet night on the farm had turned into a nightmare, and Jake knew that what would emerge in the coming hours would shake the small town of Timber Creek to its foundations. The ambulance arrived with the sheriff. Paramedics immediately took over Rachel's care, stabilizing her and preparing her for transport to the hospital in Billings. She was in critical condition, had trauma, broken ribs, internal injuries. The doctor told Jake that if he'd arrived even 20 minutes later, it probably would have been too late. Sheriff Tom Brady, a man in his 50s who Jake had known for years, took his statement on the spot. Jake told everything. The girl who'd knocked on his door, what she'd said, how he'd found Rachel. The sheriff listened with an increasingly grim expression. When Jake mentioned that the attacker was probably David Harrison, Rachel's husband, the sheriff shook his head with disbelief, but not surprise. He said something that made Jake's blood run cold. This wasn't the first time they'd received reports about David Harrison. Over the past 2 years, there had been 3 anonymous calls reporting screams and suspicious noises from the house. But every time deputies went to check, David had greeted them with his friendly smile, shown the house in perfect order. Rachel had said everything was fine, just a heated discussion, and they, fooled by the lawyer's impeccable reputation, had left. The sheriff said bitterly that David Harrison was a skilled monster who'd built a perfect facade, while behind closed doors he tortured his wife, and probably the child too. Though Emma seemed physically unharmed that night, her scratches were from her desperate run through the fields in the dark. The search for David Harrison began immediately. His car wasn't in front of the house. He'd clearly left Rachel for dead and fled. But where? Deputies set up roadblocks on all main roads, alerted nearby stations, issued an arrest warrant. Jake returned to his farm, where Emma had stayed with a female deputy. The child had fallen asleep, exhausted, on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket. Her innocent face, now cleaned of mud and blood, showed the peace of sleep. But Jake knew that behind those closed eyelids were nightmares no child should ever live through. The next day, when Emma woke up, she was taken to the hospital to be examined and to see her mother. Rachel had survived the night and was in stable but serious condition, in a medically induced coma. Doctors said her body had sustained repeated trauma over time. Not just that night. Old fractures, scars, signs of systematic violence that had probably lasted for years. Jake, in the following days, discovered a story that made him shudder. He spoke with neighbors, with townspeople, with the social worker now following the case. It emerged that David Harrison had married Rachel 15 years earlier, when she was a young teacher of 25. At first, they seemed like the perfect couple. But after Emma's birth, something had changed. David had become obsessively controlling. Rachel had stopped working. lost contact with friends and family, lived isolated in the country house. The rare times she appeared in public, she was always accompanied by David, always silent, always wearing sunglasses even when there was no sun, probably to hide the bruises. But nobody had done anything. The town had chosen not to see, not to ask, to accept the facade David presented. After all, he was a respected lawyer, a successful businessman, a benefactor. Who were they to doubt? Jake felt rage building inside him. Rage for Rachel, for Emma, for all the times someone had suspected but hadn't acted. Rage for a system that protected the powerful and ignored the vulnerable. David Harrison was found 3 days later. He'd driven to Seattle and hidden in a cheap hotel, probably planning to escape abroad. But deputies, following his credit card trail, tracked him down and arrested him while he was trying to reach the airport. When he was brought back to Timber Creek in handcuffs, the entire town was outside the sheriff's station, not to support David, as perhaps he'd expected, but to express disgust. News of what he'd done had spread, and the facade had crumbled. People who once respected him now looked at him with horror. Rachel remained in the hospital for 3 weeks. When she finally woke from the coma, the first thing she asked for was her daughter. She was told Emma was fine, safe, that the man who'd saved them both was taking care of her. Jake had done something that surprised him. When social services asked who could temporarily care for Emma while Rachel recovered, he'd volunteered. He didn't know why. Maybe because the girl reminded him of the daughter he and Sarah had always dreamed of having, but never could. Maybe because he felt he needed to do more than just save them that night. Emma, initially shy and traumatized, had slowly started to open up. Jake had given her the guest room, enrolled her in the town school, taken her to see her mother every day at the hospital. And slowly, very slowly, he'd started to see smiles on the girl's face. Small smiles, cautious, but smiles. One evening, while they ate dinner together, Jake had cooked spaghetti with tomato sauce, the only thing he knew how to make decently. Emma had said something that squeezed his heart. She said it was the first time in so long that she wasn't afraid at home, that she could laugh without worrying someone would get angry, that she could be a kid. Jake had to excuse himself and go to the bathroom to hide his tears. When Rachel finally left the hospital, it was an emotional moment. Jake went to pick her up with Emma. Mother and daughter hugged crying in the hospital parking lot, and Jake stayed back, giving them space. But when Rachel turned to him, eyes still full of tears, and simply said, "Thank you," Jake understood that word contained a universe of meaning. Rachel and Emma temporarily moved into Jake's farm. The house where they'd lived the nightmare was under seizure for investigation, and anyway, neither wanted to ever set foot there again. Jake had suggested they stay with him until Rachel found a place. The farm was big, there was room, and honestly, he appreciated the company. In the following months, something unexpected happened. The farm, which had been a place of loneliness and pain after Sarah's death.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Slowly started transforming back into a home. Emma filled the rooms with her laughter, helped Jake feed the chickens, learned to milk the goats. Rachel, while recovering physically and emotionally, started cooking, tending the garden Jake had neglected, bringing life to those empty spaces. Jake found himself smiling again, looking forward instead of backward. He wasn't in love with Rachel, not yet at least, but there was a deep connection between them, forged in shared trauma and healing. They were 3 broken souls helping each other become whole again. David Harrison's trial was swift and definitive. Evidence was overwhelming. Rachel's medical reports, Emma's testimony, forensic traces in the house, witnesses confirming years of suspicious behavior. David was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, aggravated domestic violence, child abuse. During the trial, David never showed remorse. To the end, he tried to maintain the facade, to paint himself as the victim, to say Rachel was unstable, that he'd had to discipline her. But nobody believed him. The mask had fallen permanently. The shock wave from the Harrison case didn't stop at the conviction. The small town of Timber Creek was forced to look in the mirror and confront uncomfortable truths. How had they not seen? How had they ignored the signs? Sheriff Brady organized a series of public meetings on domestic violence, inviting psychologists, social workers, specialized lawyers. People attended in droves, many with shame in their eyes for not having done anything when they suspected. Other stories emerged. Other women who'd suffered in silence, who now found courage to speak, seeing that Rachel had survived. The town discovered David Harrison wasn't an isolated case. He was just the most glaring, the best hidden. Jake became, despite himself, a central figure in this change. He hadn't sought attention, but people sought him out, wanted to know what had pushed him to act that night, how he'd found the courage they hadn't had. Jake's answer was always the same. He hadn't done anything heroic. He'd simply done what anyone should do, help someone in danger. The real courage, he said, was Emma's, who'd run through the fields in the dark to save her mother. The real courage was Rachel's, who every day woke up and chose to start over. 1 year after that storm night, life on the farm had found a new rhythm. Rachel had found work as a teacher at the town school, the same school Emma attended. She'd started smiling again, though she still carried scars, physical and emotional, from what she'd endured. Emma had become a lively, sunny child, though occasionally she still had nightmares that woke her in the middle of the night. But Jake or Rachel were always there, ready to comfort her, to remind her she was safe. And Jake had discovered something he thought he'd lost forever when Sarah died. A reason to get up in the morning. A family. A purpose. The farm was no longer a place of loneliness, but of shared life. One spring evening, while they all ate dinner together on the porch, watching the sunset over the Montana mountains, Emma asked Jake if she could call him Dad. Jake felt tears rising, unable to speak for the emotion. Rachel took his hand, her eyes saying what words couldn't. Jake looked at these two women that life had brought him in such dramatic and unexpected ways, and realized that sometimes families aren't the ones you're born into. Sometimes they're the ones you build from the ruins of pain, piece by piece, day by day. 2 years after that storm night, Jake and Rachel married in a simple ceremony at Timber Creek's small church. Emma was the maid of honor. Wearing a white dress and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself in the fields around the farm. It wasn't a marriage born from overwhelming passion, but from something deeper, mutual respect, gratitude, and a love grown slowly from the roots of shared healing. Jake had found purpose again. Rachel had found safety and peace. Emma had found a father who protected her instead of hurting her. The house where Rachel and Emma had lived, the Nightmare, was sold. With the money, Rachel opened a support center for domestic violence victims in Timber Creek. It was a small space downtown, with safe rooms where women could take refuge, counselors who could help them, lawyers offering free legal assistance. Rachel called the center Emma's House, in honor of the daughter who'd had the courage to run through the fields that night to ask for help. The girl who'd saved not only her mother, but also sparked change in an entire town. The center quickly became a reference point, not just for Timber Creek, but for the entire county. Women from neighboring towns came there to find refuge, to find someone to listen, to find the strength to break the cycle of violence. Rachel, who'd lived that nightmare firsthand, knew exactly what to say, how to listen, how to help. Jake supported the center in every way possible. He donated part of the farm's profits, helped with maintenance work, and occasionally spoke to support groups, sharing his perspective on how even strangers could make a difference if they chose to act instead of ignore. Emma grew up surrounded by this example of resilience and action. She did well in school, had friends, participated in town activities. Her nightmares had become rare. Therapy had helped her process the trauma, and Jake and Rachel's constant love had given her the security needed to heal. When she turned 14, Emma wrote a school essay titled "The Night That Changed Everything." In it, she told with raw honesty what she'd lived through: the fear of that run through the fields, the terror of losing her mother, and then the hope when she'd seen the light from Jake's farmhouse through the rain. The essay was so powerful that her teacher submitted it to a national writing contest, and Emma won first prize. When she went to Denver to accept the award, with Jake and Rachel proudly sitting in the audience, she said something in her acceptance speech that moved the entire room. "I thought that night was the end of everything. Instead, it was just the beginning. The beginning of a new life, a new family, a new hope, and I learned that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they're just lonely farmers who open the door when someone knocks desperately in the rain." David Harrison died in prison 5 years after his conviction. A heart attack during the night. When Rachel received the news, she felt no joy but no pain either. Just a strange sense of closure, as if a dark chapter of her life had finally closed definitively. She decided not to tell Emma immediately. The girl, now 17, was preparing for her SATs and had a bright future ahead. She'd already received scholarship offers from several universities to study psychology. She wanted to become a therapist specializing in childhood trauma, to help other children like her. But one evening, while they walked together in the fields at sunset, a ritual they'd maintained over the years, Rachel told her. Emma stayed silent for a long moment, watching the horizon where the sun painted the sky orange and pink. Then she said something that showed how much she'd grown, how mature she was beyond her years. "I'm not glad he's dead, Mom, but I'm glad he can't hurt anyone anymore. And I'm grateful that I ran that night, that I found Jake, that we made it." Rachel hugged her daughter, realizing the terrified 7-year-old had become a strong and compassionate young woman, not despite the trauma she'd lived through, but partly because of how she'd chosen to process and overcome it. Jake, now 52, watched his 2 women from the farmhouse porch. His hair was grayer, his hands rougher from work, but his heart was fuller than it had ever been. The farm, which had been a monument to loneliness after Sarah's death, was now a place of vibrant life. He often thought about that storm night, about how a single moment of choice, opening that door instead of ignoring the knocking, had changed 3 lives forever. He wondered what would have happened if he'd pretended not to hear, if he'd gone to bed ignoring the pounding. Rachel would have died. Emma would have ended up in an orphanage, and he'd still be alone, trapped in the past. But he'd opened that door, and in opening it, he'd saved not just Rachel and Emma, but also himself. Emma's house continued to grow. After 10 years of operation, it had helped hundreds of women escape domestic violence situations. Many of them, once they'd rebuilt their lives, came back as volunteers to help other women, creating a chain of support and hope. Rachel had written a book about her experience, titled Beyond the Storm. It became a bestseller across America, read by thousands of women who recognized themselves in her story. All proceeds from the book went to fund the center and expand services offered. Jake had expanded the farm, hiring 2 young people from town to help him. He produced organic beef, vegetables, and honey, all organic products he sold at local markets, and which had gained a good reputation. But he didn't do it for money. He did it because he loved that work, that land, that life he'd built with his family. When Emma left for college in Bozeman, it was a bittersweet moment. Jake and Rachel drove her, helped her settle into the dorm, then returned to the farm that suddenly seemed too quiet. But Emma came back every weekend, bringing friends, stories of her new life, fresh energy. And when she graduated with honors 4 years later, specializing in trauma psychology, Jake and Rachel were in the front row, applauding with tears of pride. Emma opened her practice in Timber Creek, in collaboration with Emma's house. She offered free therapy to children who'd experienced domestic violence using innovative techniques she'd learned at university, and the deep empathy that came from her personal experience. The circle had closed. The saved child had become the savior. The victim had become the healer. And the family born from tragedy had become a beacon of hope for an entire community. One evening, 20 years after that storm night, Jake, Rachel, and Emma, now 30, sat together on the farm porch. Emma had just announced she was pregnant with her first child. Jake would become a grandfather. Watching the sunset over the Montana mountains, the same mountains Emma had crossed running desperately that distant night, the three held hands in silence. There was no need for words. They all knew what that moment represented. Not the end of their story, but a new beginning. And Jake thought about something he'd realized over the years, that sometimes life's darkest moments can become the foundation on which you build the brightest light. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite fear. And that love, the real kind, the kind that heals, the kind that saves, often arrives when you least expect it, knocking desperately at your door on a storm night. Like if you believe every act of courage, even small ones, can change a life. Comment if you've ever helped someone in need, or if someone has helped you. Share this story of courage, healing, and found family. Subscribe for more stories, proving hope exists even in the darkest nights. Sometimes all it takes to save a life is opening a door. And sometimes, in opening that door to help someone else, you save yourself, too. Jake Mitchell wasn't trying to be a hero that storm night, but by listening to a child's desperate cries and acting instead of ignoring, he became exactly that. And he proved that real courage isn't found in grand gestures, but in the small daily choices to be present, to listen, to act when someone needs help.